to Alignment, using your values to invest in social change, brought to you by Oikocredit US. We're proud to bring you this 8th in our series of interviews with experts in the field of values-based investing. I'm Matt Eldridge, CEO of Oikocredit US. Today, we're delighted to have as our special guest, Donna Katzin, former founding executive director at the nonprofit social investment fund Shared Interest. How have people and organizations used their investments to help oust apartheid in South Africa and then fuel economic empowerment in the region? Stay tuned to find out. Before I introduce Donna, just a quick word about who we are. Oikocredit US is the nonprofit US affiliate of Oikocredit International, a 46-year-old global cooperative that works to improve living conditions in low-income countries. Oikocredit does so by investing in microfinance and small and medium-sized enterprises in Latin America, Africa, and Asia. Our job here at Oikocredit US is to raise awareness and financial support in North America for these efforts. I'm so happy to speak today with Donna. In her role at Shared Interest, she grew the organization from inception in 1994 to become one of the leading institutional impact investors in Southern Africa. What does that mean exactly? We're going to ask her. Prior to founding Shared Interest, Donna worked at the Interfaith Center for Corporate Responsibility, or ICCR, which was a key player in the movement to divest from South Africa during the apartheid years and compel that country's transition to democracy. Donna earned her doctorate in human services education and development from Union Graduate School, a master's from Columbia University, and a bachelor's from Smith College. She's also the author of With These Hands, a volume of poetry inspired by the birth of South Africa's democracy. Donna, thanks for joining us. Welcome.
Well, thank you, Matt, and thank you and Oikocredit for your tremendous, tremendous work all of these years, which we salute and recognize and applaud. And thank you for the opportunity to have this conversation.
Well, thanks, Donna. It's really my pleasure. And Donna, first question, you spent 8 years at the Interfaith Center for Corporate Responsibility, or ICCR, then 27 years at Shared Interest. You've devoted your entire career and then some to social justice, ousting apartheid, and promoting economic development. What first inspired you to pursue this path? Why do you do what you do?
When I think back to it, I think of critical importance was growing up on the south side of Chicago, where racial and economic injustice was built in to the fabric of people's everyday lives. I can remember too, it was a progressive community, it was a multiracial community, but it was largely a middle-class community. And we knew that crossing certain streets put us into a basically tremendously low-income community where people were suffering just to make ends meet every day. I can remember back when I was something like 3 or 4 years old, when an African-American woman who was a close friend of my parents was at our house and they were talking about what was going on in the world. This would have been 3 or 4 years after apartheid became the law of the land in South Africa, after the Nats took power in '48. And I remember saying to my friend, I said, why do people do these things? You know, we're talking about the atrocities. Why do people do things like that? And she said to me, oh, honey, she said, people are terrible over there. And I never knew what that meant. So for many years, I walked around with what was it that was so terrible? And I didn't really fully understand for a decade, close to 2 decades. I also had the opportunity to work with the labor movement as part of the UAW. And there got my first opportunity to work on apartheid, where the visionary leader of the New Jersey region, Leslie Roberts, set up the New Jersey Anti-Apartheid Mobilization Coalition and asked me to run it. And so there I had a daily experience, not only of doing corporate campaigns to press apartheid to pursue peaceful, in South Africa to pursue peaceful change rather than violence, but also showed me what the solidarity between working people could contribute to economic and racial justice.
Wow, that's so interesting. I hadn't realized, or I'd forgotten just how the labor movement in the US was actively working to try to raise awareness around apartheid and fight apartheid. How did that work at the UAW?
Well, there were many parts of the UAW, from the international division to, but for us, it was workers at the community level, chemical workers, factory workers, healthcare workers, women who saw the face of their own pain and poverty reflected in what was going on in South Africa, and fighting for people's rights as workers and workers of color in many, many cases, really propelled the movement on the ground. We had some really wonderful campaigns. We were part of the Shell boycott, as many, many people were. That coalition launched one of the best bumper stickers of all time, which was "Get the Shell off the turnpike." And we actually did get the Shell off the turnpike, and that franchise cost them the franchise. But people really felt this campaign in their veins.
You know, Donna, the story of shared interest is an amazing one with a remarkable trajectory. But before I ask you about that, tell us more about ICCR. By coincidence, that's where you and I first met back in 1981. I was a college student writing my senior thesis on sanctions against South Africa and got a grant to fly to the East Coast to interview key players in the sanctions movement. And for those who don't know, what is ICCR and what role did it play to help bring democracy to South Africa?
The Interfaith Center on Corporate Responsibility is a nonprofit organization that is going to be 50 years old this year, that was built on rallying the power of basically faith-based organizations. Now there are also some other members, more than 250 of them, and using their power together to move corporations to be accountable and to pursue, to the extent that they can, agendas of human rights and economic justice and environmental justice as well. And together, those members did some incredible things. They used not only divestment, but a panoply of strategies. So there were dialogues with corporations. There was engagement with corporations. In some cases, people held the shares so that they could continue to be active. In some cases, they divested and they sold their shares in protest. Sometimes they were out there on the picket lines and demonstrating. Sometimes they got the Coke machines off their campuses. They did a variety of things, and in that way reflected the anti-apartheid movement, which had many different streams. But particularly powerful in the latter days of apartheid were the corporate campaigns against the quote-unquote dirty dozen and other companies, so oil companies, computer companies, etc., strategic companies. And the long-term voice and the long-term vision of faith communities, we're talking women religious organizations, dioceses, denominations, individual congregations, that vision was was a wonderful force in the movement for justice, because it was so long-term. People did not expect to see justice in 24 hours, and they knew that vision and that tenacity and that faith had to be maintained. And they played a big role in maintaining it in the movement.
Was there much connection in the years that you were with ICCR with Oikocredit?
There was some, yes. No, we had communication, yes. And collaborated with a lot of organizations that everybody played their particular piece. And it was helping to weave that fabric together that was so powerful.
In 1994, Nelson Mandela became the first democratically elected president of South Africa. And as it happens, I had the privilege of following his campaign as the focus of my master's dissertation at the University of Cape Town. And that same year, in 1994, you left ICCR to found Shared Interest. Where did that idea come from, and how did you get started?
Well, ICCR in 1994 recognized that the campaign to end apartheid was going to basically declare victory and not continue to be an organizing focus for the organization. They broadened it into broader human rights and economic and environmental justice. But I wanted to continue working on South Africa, and was very clear on what a South African street vendor said most succinctly, that political freedom without economic freedom is not freedom. So we knew this thing was just beginning. Political power changed hands in South Africa. Economic power did not change hands. And so we looked around for other organizations to see who we could partner with, who was doing what. the Fund for a Free South Africa, FRISA, in Boston, an organization started by Black South Africans in exile, had been making grants. They were looking for ways of potentially using investments, conscious of the power of the social investment movement. And so I had the opportunity to work with them to help develop what had already been started by some really important standard bearers like Robert Seven, Beata Kleinbecker, and people who were looking at vehicles for ordinary people to invest in helping build a new South Africa. And so together, in consultation with the friends and colleagues that we had established during movement times in South Africa, and in communication too with some of the corporations and companies that we had worked with, including people that we had targeted during the bank campaign to isolate banking ties to South Africa. The institutions might have been doing that, but there were plenty of people on our side. And some of those people, including one of the top people at JP Morgan, came up to us and said, you know, you should really think about a guarantee fund, because think what you could do. So we took our advice from forward-thinking people everywhere, and we're very, very happy to be able to launch that guarantee fund. And then when it got too big to sit as a subsidiary or as a project of FRISA and needed to be in New York where the banks were, we went independent and established shared interest as its own 501c3.
Got it. That's interesting. And so the idea of the using loan guarantees came from an ally at JP Morgan.
Well, he wasn't the only one. I mean, it was one of the options that we had been thinking about, and we were very attracted to the idea because we knew of many loan funds, credit unions that were borrowing to lend, borrowing in the global north, most often to lend in the global south. And we thought we were very much taken with the work that Archbishop Tutu was doing, because Archbishop Tutu had been our partner in the financial sanctions campaign. Now, he would have run afoul of the law and ended up in jail if he'd come out and said financial sanctions. But in fact, his banking representative and his banking advisor was one of our closest allies in determining these strategies, where the weak points in the South African banking system lay, and what kinds of measures and pressures would be most instrumental. So his call, the Archbishop, had always talked about first the need for pressure, but then he said to us, he said, you know, the end of apartheid was only part one of the struggle, but part two is the more difficult, to make the miracle endure. And he said, we asked you to disinvest. Now we say to you, invest, make South Africa succeed for the sake of the world. So fine, we knew we wanted to invest. But key also to this vision was the Arch's idea of restorative justice. And that is that it is not just about individuals benefiting. He did plenty of that in the pastoral side of his life, helping individuals deal with their grief, their challenges, their potential. But he also knew that the system had to change. And for that, as we thought about what that meant, it meant to us that it would be more strategic if we could help do something to push apartheid institutions to act differently, particularly the financial institutions, to get them to do nothing, and this sounds like total hubris, but to get the banks to just change the way they bank a little bit. You know, this is not everything they do. And so we set out through the guarantee fund with the goal of guarantee loans we'd get South African financial institutions to make to people in their own country, to the Black majority that remained completely economically marginalized and exploited, and to make this kind of a systems impact. So that was one of the reasons that we chose the guarantee model. We were very small at that point. Shared interest is still, relatively speaking, small, but able to have a larger impact because of its systems impact on financial institutions, as well as on markets, value chains, and partnerships.
Donna, that's very interesting to hear more about the loan guarantee model. I just have a quick follow-up there. So one of the reasons that's also innovative is because it's not about investing directly in equity or making loans, but rather putting funds on the line in case a borrower is unable to repay.
Right.
Why did you choose that model? I understand that idea came about, but why did you choose that model in particular? And what have you seen as the advantages and disadvantages of it over time?
We did it as an incentive to move South African, and now they've broadened out, so Southern African financial institutions to lend to people they would not consider, in some cases, even human beings, much less clients. And the goal has always been, and it has been achieved a good number of times, where a bank will come back when somebody's guarantee is up, say a small business is, their guarantee is finished, it's matured, and we'll say to them, would you like another guarantee? And they'll say to you, what do we need to pay you a guarantee fee for? What do we need another guarantee? This is a perfectly normal customer. This is our everyday business. And we say to them, exactly. So that's the idea. Some days it's easier than others, but that is the goal. And over time, we can definitely see progress in that direction. Also, it enables us to enable shared interest to work with a number of different partners. Right now, they're working with partners in different countries, Mozambique, Swatini, Malawi, and Zambia, in addition to South Africa. And one amazing thing is that we have also been able to show that South African borrowers and now Southern African borrowers are good bets. They are good business. And for everybody that says, oh my God, low income, people of color, new, first-time businesses, risk, risk, risk. There is risk. There is clearly risk. The issue is how you handle it. And to date, 27 years, shared interests investors have not lost a cent of interest or principal.
That's amazing. That's such an incredible track record. And also, like you say, has helped really prove the concept for many of these banks that really should have been lending anyway, but needed that extra compulsion. And it seems like through the loan guarantees, you were able to de-risk those loans for them essentially, and kind of help provide that nudge to get it done.
Yeah, we never de-risked them totally because always required, we never guaranteed more than 75% and often less, and in some cases cut back over time. The goal is to get the banks into the business of lending to their own people and mobilizing their own resources.
Fantastic. You know, Donna, in the world of funds like shared interest or even Oikocredit, which is actually a cooperative but generally works like a fund, discussions often gravitate toward the language of funds, return on investment, deal structure, terms, and so on. But what about the human side? Even though shared interest provides loan guarantees to financial intermediaries, what impact on borrowers have you personally witnessed that's hit home for you?
Let me think about it on three different levels. Looking at the community level, one of the first times this ever hit me about community transformation was on the 5th anniversary of South Africa's democratic elections. So Freedom Day, April 27th, 1999. I go to visit a project in the Eastern Cape where people are building houses. We've co-guaranteed this project, and several 100,000 people ultimately were able to build their own homes with capacity building and support, but above all, finance. And so I choose to go out there. The only time I had was Freedom Day, and I called up the quality control guy. I said, I'd love to see what's happening in Keyskamahuk. He said, well, you know it's Freedom Day. I said, yeah, I know it's Freedom Day. He said, but so nobody's going to be doing anything, but you could see what they're working on. I said, that's great. I'd love to see the houses. So he takes me out in the middle of flat out what would ordinarily look like nowhere. And we come to these buildings under construction, and the place is a beehive of activity. And women in long skirts are singing, and they are laying tile, they are building their roofs, they're hanging doors, they're doing all this stuff. The quality control guy is apoplectic. because he's supposed to be controlling the quality, and he didn't even know they were going to do this. And he says to them, this woman's standing on a barrel doing her roof. He says, "Mama, sorry, we didn't know you were going to be working today. It's Freedom Day." And she said, "It is Freedom Day. We are building our houses." And so that sense of lifting the community. Also, the impact on groups is powerful. In Mozambique, visiting a community that had been victimized by terrible floods in 2015, had come back to plant again, and they were able to plant again because our partners that we'd guaranteed had the capital, and they could support these communities and getting back on their feet, these cooperatives. And I said to the women, I said, how, after everything that you owned, knew, and loved had been swept away by the river, how did you have the strength to come back and plant again? And one woman stepped up. She said, "When I see my sister plant, I plant with her. And when I see her weed, I weed with her. And when it's harvest time, everyone comes. We don't leave anyone alone." And I thought that one of the invisible outcomes, perhaps, of this kind of work, and Oikocredit would know this as well, is helping to build community and build that intangible human capital and strength. And then the last thing, if I think about it on an individual level, I asked a woman at a sugarcane co-op that we'd guaranteed in Eastern South Africa, what the impact for her of having this project succeed and having what it needed to go forward. And she pointed to, she thought, and then she pointed to the sugarcane behind her and she said, "Now I know I have power. My power is in this cane." And I felt that the transformation, personal community, was very powerful. And, you know, I know Oikocredit has got 1,000 stories like that. This work makes those kinds of results possible. And that's some ROI. Thank you.
Absolutely. Wow. That's incredibly moving, Donna. Thanks for sharing those examples. You know, you accomplished so much at Shared Interest. It has now placed upwards of $30 million of guarantees, which unlocked over $125 million in loans. And now the organization, as you mentioned, has expanded its focus to Eswatini, formerly Swaziland, Malawi, Mozambique, and Zambia. When you look into your crystal ball and read the future, what impact do you hope Shared Interest will have over the next 27 years?
Well, somewhere in between my crystal ball and the organization's own strategic plan, there's some very exciting possibilities, and they have already begun to take place. For example, broadening Shared Interest's footprint. The region of Southern Africa, South Africa really cannot survive without the rest of the region economically. For no other reason, it's too small, its markets are too small. But also the economies, not to mention the human history of people in the region, is so tremendously interlinked. And so in growing and spreading roots throughout the region, that expanding footprint is really important. It will be more important, and is already beginning to make it possible to work with lots of new partners, advisors, and to begin to work with projects that work across borders in the region that strengthen those kinds of connections. I think the organization and I would look forward to increased work on climate. It's almost impossible to work in Southern Africa without being affected by climate change one way or another. So to work on the proactive side of that, which Shared Interest has already begun to do, not only adjusting to climate change, which is critical, but also beginning to mitigate it. And there are already projects in the works and on the guarantee list that are beginning to do that kind of work. New sectors, very exciting. You may see some more work in technology. But there's also great possibility in the United States at this point in our history, because in the US, as we look at issues like racism, like economic injustice, like environmental injustice, we, not to mention the pandemic, we recognize that our survival as a species cannot just be accomplished in one country. pandemics, climate, racism, economic oppression don't stop at the border. You've heard the ad, shingles doesn't care, racism doesn't care, COVID doesn't care, economic injustice doesn't care. And so recognizing that the theme that the organization was started was the theme and recognition that we have shared interests. And now as I see that awareness rising in the United States and around the world, I think its time has come.
Thanks, Donna. It's funny because I think when I initially heard the name shared interest, I wasn't sure what to make of it. And now in this conversation, as I've thought about it, there's so many different meanings embedded in the name, from interest on loans to interest in our mutual mutual interest as a species in improving, and helping empower and work for economic and social justice. So that's all very helpful to hear. I couldn't help but notice on Shared Interest website that Archbishop Desmond Tutu, who you mentioned, who passed away the day after Christmas last month, was the honorary chair of its advisory board. How did his work for racial and economic justice in South Africa inspire you personally? And what do you hope others will learn from his example?
Yeah, the world lost a prophet, a partner, and ordinary people everywhere, quote unquote, ordinary people, lost a friend when the Arch died. For us, some of us, we were privileged to have worked with him when we first, when ICCR went out of the anti-apartheid business per se. He came to me and he said, "Well, Donna, we see we've worked you out of a job, have we?" And I said, "Oh no, Arch, actually, we now have another bigger job," and explained to him about shared interest. And he said, "I will be there, I will help." And it was because of his vision of restorative justice, which is one of the things that I think is most important about to take from his legacy, restoring not just individuals, not just families, but an entire society, which means just institutions, just policies, and a just distribution of wealth and all resources. So that's a key concept. He was born in the tradition of Ubuntu, which means Southern African concept, which means I am because you are. People are people through other people. And that is the only way we can achieve our humanity. And that is a key concept, I think, for the work that we do. And people of many, many, many faiths, all faiths, I think, have a great deal to learn from that. The Archbishop embodied Ubuntu. He also had this view, which was interesting, to hold two things in his mind and heart at the same time, to be true to and ferocious about day-to-day struggles, individual suffering, an unjust situation, an immediate victory, and at the same time know that the struggles and the issues that were in front of us these days are not victories that people are going to win and live to see in their own lifetimes. And he was able to hold that sense of tenacity of the moment, but also faith and commitment to the future. And I would also hope that people would take not only his faith, but his hope, his unsinkable courage, and his abiding love.
Well said, Donna. That's such an eloquent way of putting it. And certainly he brought such an insouciant and unstoppable level of joy and inspiration. I found every time I listened to him speak, it was hard not to feel deeply, deeply moved and inspired.
Absolutely.
Donna, a silver lining of the pandemic for some people has been that it's forced them to reflect on their life, their work, and how they've spent their time. As you've left Shared Interest in good hands and have spent more than a little time in isolation over the past 2 years, what can you share with us about your own reflections? What's next for you?
Well, the first reflection is thank God for Zoom. because we would have all been a whole lot more isolated without Zoom. The times when it doesn't make us crazy, it makes us stronger. So that's been good. I haven't really, I'm still doing a little bit of work with shared interest, because they pointed out to me something that I had said to many people, that you can leave the organization, but you can't leave the family. So having mouthed that, I'm now on the receiving end of it, and I'm now beginning to see what it feels like. And frankly, it feels really good to continue to be part of that ongoing and broadening family. At the same time, one thing I'm grateful for is the opportunity to have more time to work on racial and economic justice issues at home. And so I'm on the board of a 50-year-old organization called Community Change, which works to build power in Black and Brown communities, and is a tremendous voice for economic, racial, and gender justice here in the US. I'm continuing to be co-coordinator of something called Tippy Tapa Partners, which works with our partners in Nicaragua and helps low-income women feed 520 kids every day and organize their communities to create jobs for their kids. And occasionally I have some time for writing. I continue to write poetry and some more nonfiction, non-poetry, part of the US-Africa Bridge Building Project, a really interesting initiative to bring people on the continent and in the United States closer together. And I'm just, in closing, open to and interested in new opportunities to be a partner and ally to address the critical needs of our time, and also to help pass the torch to the next generation.
Thanks, Donna. That's so good to know you're letting, and no surprise that you're letting no moss grow underfoot. There are so many needs that remain in so many parts of the world, including here at home. It's great to know that you're continuing to be actively involved on multiple fronts. That's all the time we have for today. Thank you all very much for tuning in, and to those of you who send in questions. And thank you, Donna, for joining us in this series of interviews we're calling Alignment, Using Your Values to Invest in Social Change. Please join us at the same time on Wednesday, February 23rd for our next interview in the Alignment series. Alignment is made possible by generous donations from people like you. You can also invest in Oikocredit's impact through our recoverable grant program. If you'd like to learn more about shared interests, visit sharedinterest.org. If you'd like to check out With These Hands, Donna's volume of poetry inspired by the birth of South Africa's democracy, see the link in the YouTube description for this episode. For more about Oikocredit US or how to support our mission to improve living standards in low-income countries, visit our website at oikocreditus.org. Until next time, on behalf of everyone at Oikocredit US, thanks for your support. See you soon.